Welcome everyone to the latest NIHR ARC Northwest Coast MIDAS seminar, which is kindly being given by Julie Cook, who's a research fellow at the University of Central Lancashire, and more importantly is the vice chair of the health ethics panel at UCLan. It's very kindly agreed to come and talk to us today about how to get ethics. Just to let you know that the session is being recorded so that it can be made available to people who can't attend later. There'll be an opportunity at the end of the session, unless Julie would like it to people to ask questions during the actual seminar itself, to ask questions at that point. So I'll hand over to Julie. Julie.
Okay, right. Thank you, Andy. Hi, thank you, everybody. It's nice to see you. Thank you for inviting me to come and do this today. So, yeah, what we're going to talk about is getting ethics and this question of what do you need to think about to get ethical approval? What do you need to think about to do your research? So what we thought we'd do today is to take a bit of an exploratory approach to this, because I'm aware that within the Northwest Coast networks, people have been talking about wanting some more training or support development, things like that, or just consideration for around research ethics. And what I thought that we could do today was, as part of the discussions really, just to try and find out what people would like to know. What do you need? We can talk about some of your immediate issues in a discussion, but maybe trying to think about how we might develop some of those needs into more targeted sessions to look at specific issues. So I've tried to take a fairly broad approach, so I hope there aren't any big gaps in there for you, but if there are big gaps, in a way that's good, because then we can identify what people need. But I really hope that there will be things that will fill some of those gaps and prompt some discussion as well. So I'm here, as Andy said, I work at UCLan. My own background, quite a long time ago now, is in the NHS and the third sector, mainly working on women's health issues. And I'm now a research fellow in the Applied Health Research Hub at UCLan, which is kind of adjacent to the MIDAS team. I myself mainly work on evaluations of health and social care services, and I imagine that a lot of you may be thinking about doing similar kinds of work. And I also specialise in research ethics itself as an academic subject, so I'm actually really interested in talking about these issues, and I'm really interested in what everyone's got to say today. And I am vice chair of the UCLan Health Ethics Panel, which means I do a lot of ethics reviews. So I have some good anecdotes and some good examples of good and perhaps not so good practice that we could maybe explore later on. I'm hoping that this is why you're all here, that you want these questions answered. So what I'm proposing to do is to do a bit of an outline of some of the processes for getting an ethical approval, partly really just to get those out of the way, because I know that we can get quite bogged down in the processes and in a sense almost forget what it is we're trying to achieve, because they can be a bit overwhelming sometimes. So my idea always is that if we understand what we're trying to achieve when we're doing something, we're likely to get there a bit more easily. So that's the kind of way that I've approached this today. So just thinking about all of the statutory processes and structures there are for getting ethical approval for research, and doing it in the right order is important as well. But it really can seem a bit like a maze with some added obstacles in it. And if I was in the room, I would offer like a chocolate bar or something to anyone who can tell me where this is, because I really hope there is somebody, at least one other person in the room, that recognises this place. So I'm going to stop for a minute. Does anyone want to shout out? Nobody at all, because it's quite local. So this is actually, and that is a real picture. It's at Speak Hall in Merseyside, which is the National Trust. I think it's National Trust Place near sort of near the airport. And it's amazing. It has this amazing maze, and it is, so yeah, it is a genuine maze, and it is really quite nearby. So somewhere you can go if you want to. So anyway, that's my tourist brochure for the day for the Northwest. But it can feel a lot like this sometimes when you're trying to work out what you need to navigate, where you need to look, and as I say, what order to do things in. So I'm trying to do a little bit of a summary here today. So I'm not going to go through all of these rather dense looking slides in detail, but I've put them in the presentation so that when you get a copy of it, or you can get a copy of it, you've got that information there to refer to. But if we're thinking about ethical approvals for either health or social care research, there is a centralised system for that governance, and that all goes now through the Health Research Authority, or the HRA, and it is mandatory to comply with that. So whatever you're doing, whether you're doing that in the NHS or whether you're doing that within health and social care, the local R&D department of the NHS Trust or the local authority will be the people who should be able to guide you through that process and make it clear to you what you need to do, where you need to go. And it is possible that you might also need ethical approval from somewhere else, like a university, and we'll come on to that in a little while. So that's the HRA. There's a very dense list here of the kinds of NHS research projects that people might be doing. I've put at the top of this list for today the sorts of things I'm imagining most of the people here might be doing, which is more exactly low level, but not a full-scale clinical trial anyway, but anything that involves questionnaires and interviews. If you're doing either just qualitative methods or just working with data, you are going to need Health Research Authority approval. So that's just something to think about when you're approaching your research. What kind of thing is it? Where do I need to go? We won't go through the whole list there, but that gives you some idea, the kinds of things that if you're doing them, you will need that level of approval. Social care research is the same, goes through the same facility, and all of those studies need to do that, particularly if you're looking at anything that requires approval under the Mental Capacity Act, or if you're working, as people often do in social care type research, with organisations that are maybe independent organisations. That could be a small local charity or an NGO. User-led research sometimes will fall more under this than it will under anywhere else. So if you're doing the sort of research that needs ethical approval and you don't know where else to go, this might be a good place to start, if that's your feeling that it probably needs that. So those are those two aspects, and they do have a decision tool on the website there that will tell you what kind of approvals are required. So you can go through and say, yes, I'm doing this, no, I'm doing that, and it will kind of funnel you to tell you what you need to do. But just a reminder there as well that if you are doing some research, it also has to go through your local trust or local authority, so that they know what you're doing, basically. And if you have their permission in place, you're going to get a lot more cooperation from your colleagues as well. And you've got the support of that department, so that you're not sort of operating as a lone operator, if you like. You're within this network of things. There is a kind of intermediate category of projects which the HRA will classify as something like audit or evaluation. And in that case, it generally doesn't have to go through full NHS research ethics committees. It's a much more lighter touch from their end of things, but often you will still need to get the ethical approval from a university or somewhere like that to do that study. So you can begin to get a feel of how it is a bit of a maze, but it does make sense, and we can find our way through that maze if we take the advice of people who know what they're doing. Just a quick note about research in other settings. I'm not sure if anybody here does any kind of research or work either at somewhere like prisons or with the Ministry of Defence, but just thinking about some of the research that some of my colleagues do, for example, it may well come up in the kinds of areas that people might be working in. For example, we have colleagues who do a lot of work around greening of prisons, so things like horticulture and also food. That again would come under that kind of framework, and they would have to have specific approvals from the prison service. Ministry of Defence, likewise, any research involving humans would need to go through a very specific structure that they have for research ethics approvals. And I've got some colleagues who have, for example, done work around the mental health of veterans, and they needed to get Ministry of Defence approval, not for the veterans who were no longer serving, but so that they could talk to health services staff who were still in the forces about the kinds of services that they provide and the processes. So you never really know when this is going to come up, but I think it's just useful to have somewhere in the back of our heads that these structures are there, and that we can use them if we need to, but it's just something to think about when you're thinking about doing your research. Now, this slide has kindly been provided to me by UCLan's Head of Ethics, Emma Neal, as just a way of trying to map out some of the general kinds of permissions that people might need. And often, I think when we're either doing smaller scale studies or starting out in our careers, we are perhaps more likely to be doing something at perhaps a sort of a lower or easier entry level, if you like. So not a full scale clinical trial, but we might be working with a local NGO. We might be wanting to do some social media research using closed groups. We might be doing something where we need gatekeeper access through people in a community specifically that can help us, or where that research won't be successful if we don't have their agreement. So there's a whole kind of map here of kinds of things that you might need to just think about when you're putting your studies together, about whose approval might you actually need and need to evidence. Schools is one there that comes up. If you want to do research in schools, you do need specific approval from a head teacher for each school. So you can't just get your approval from whichever other body it is at your university and then just go in waving that. They will actually need to approve it in advance. So before everybody becomes completely overwhelmed by that, my big bit of advice really is get advice from somebody before you start about what you need to do. I've put an example here. This is from UCLan's own ethical approval application, which says very clearly to people that you should, for certain things, you should gain external ethical approval before you come to the UCLan approvals, and that's going to be similar frameworks for various other universities for anybody that's based in a university. So often this information is there. It should be in the guidance, or it will be there with talking to the people. And you know, one of the most important bits of advice I think we can ever have really is to go to the people who know and to ask them before you start, because that way you're not going to waste time, you're not going to get confused, and they will be able to tell you what order you need to do things in. So I mentioned the University Research Ethics Committees a couple of times, and it's just to flag up really that every university has its own research ethics committees. They all arrange them differently. If they're doing anything to do with human tissue or, for example, animal experiments, they will have specific committees for those, but that's because those are statutory legal requirements that they are operated in that kind of a way, and they may have, you know, a whole host of other committees that might deal with different disciplines or different kinds of research. But if you're doing research as a member of staff or as a student in a university, you are going to need ethical approvals. That is also the case even if the HRA has helpfully told you it isn't research, and that's something that we can come back to later, but people do sometimes get in a bit of a tangle about that one. But generally speaking, you will need to get some sort of approval from your own institution. And as I've said, just at the bottom couple of points on this slide, this issue about what order you do it in, sometimes it's better to do it through the university first. Other times you might go to, for example, the HRA. And if you get NHS ethics approval, most universities will then do a very light touch secondary review of that, just to say, yeah, it's okay for you to do that as a staff member. You've already got that approval from them, just to kind of tie that off, but it won't have to go through yet another process to do that. So I just wanted to talk through this rather the long list of this structure of different committees and approval systems, just to make sure that people know that they're there, and there are different ways of doing this depending on where you're situated and also the kind of research that you want to do. And then what I really wanted to do, and this is where we can have some discussion as we go along if people would like to do that, is just really trying to focus in on these questions of, all right, well, that's all very well, but what am I going to do? What do I need to think about, and how am I actually going to get that ethical approval before I start my research? So I wanted us to think really just about, so what should you be thinking about? What is the best approach to take? And it's very clear that research ethics in general is a rights-based framework. And most of us are much more familiar, I think, maybe sometimes even than we realise, with the idea of human rights, what human rights is, where it's come from, and how that applies to us individually and to the people around us. So I'm not going to talk in detail about where any of this has come from, but during the 20th century, we had a major shift in global politics towards this idea of human rights. That's where the Declaration of Human Rights comes from, and that is the foundation for an awful lot of the legislation that we have, the guidelines and all of those structures across the world about doing research. The core idea of that being that you can't do research with human beings unless they've consented to whatever is happening. That is the very, very core idea. There's a list of international documents there, which again, I'm not going to go through in detail. Some of them are more familiar than others. I expect a lot of people, but probably not everybody is here, has come across the Declaration of Helsinki, which is a really core one. There are also others about guidelines for doing research between high and lower income countries, and various European charters and pieces of legislation. But this list will be in, the presentation. We can make sure everybody's got access to afterwards. So you will be able to follow some of those through if you like. But for me, the idea is just that there is a history to this, and there is a structure to what goes on internationally and what is expected of us, basically, and that it comes from this very solid rights-based framework. So the way that I find it useful to think about these in terms of, right, you've got a rights-based framework, but what do you actually do with that? What does that mean in practice? Is to think about it in terms of these fairly well-established principles of biomedical ethics. So there are 4 of these. They don't have very fancy names, but we can still work through them and just think about how we might apply these to what we actually want to do, which is really the core of us getting our ethics approval, is how do we explain and decide what it is that we actually want to do in this project that we want to carry out. So the first of the 4 principles is about the autonomy of the participants, and really the core of that is consent. This is about people's capacity to make a decision, to make a meaningful decision that is their own free decision, and what they need to understand in order for that to be a genuinely free decision. And those are the kinds of areas that people are thinking about when they think about the autonomy of participants. Does anybody want to chip in at that point with anything specific about this idea of autonomy, or what it might or might not mean, or has any kind of urgent questions about that? Because I think these issues are key really to working out what it is we're trying to achieve. Or we can wait till the end, wait till later, that's fine. So the second of these principles is about justice or fairness. It amounts to the same thing in terms of these principles. At a population level, the idea of this is that the benefits and the burdens of the research should be fairly distributed. So all the research shouldn't be being done in certain groups of people, and all of the benefits shouldn't be directed to certain sorts of people. And I imagine that there are quite a lot of people here who are quite clear about the idea that we ought to be doing different kinds of research with different populations in order to make sure that both the processes and the outcomes and the very questions that we're researching are fair, in terms of especially things like health inequalities. Obviously, they have to be legal, they have to uphold the law. But the issue of vulnerability also comes under this principle. And again, I think that's something that we can maybe talk about a bit later, because it's quite a contentious issue within research ethics. Who's vulnerable? Who counts as vulnerable? Who decides who's vulnerable? And I think even just looking there at the picture that I've chosen there are a lot of different ways that you could cast that. You've got one red person and a lot of yellow people. Well, are the people wearing yellow, are they being threatened by the person who's wearing red? Is the person who is on their own who's wearing red being threatened by the group of people? Does it depend on where you're standing? I think thinking about all of those kinds of things is quite important, having an idea of other people's perspectives when we're trying to put the applications together. The idea of doing good, with a catchily named beneficence, is that the research should be doing good for people. Not that we should already know that it's going to be good for them to trial this intervention, because if we already knew the answer, it probably wouldn't be a piece of research. But thinking about what people's individual circumstances are, what's good what's good for them. And again, who is deciding that? Is that the researchers who are deciding what's good for people we want to participate in our research, and how much of a say do they get? And I guess more recently, in the last few years, there's been a lot more emphasis, isn't there, on patient participant public involvement and in co-design and things like that, and trying to make sure that that gets built in early on about who's deciding what's good, what are good questions, what's good practice. And the fourth is the other side of the doing good, but it's actively doing no harm. And as I say, that's at the core. That's at the real core of research ethics, is that we should not be doing any harm to anybody. Now, clearly, lots of the many famous and diabolical stories that we know from history are evidently come up here. But this isn't just about the intervention itself. These days, what we're thinking about, especially if we're thinking about research in this country, we're thinking about things like inconvenience that we might cause to participants. Is there an expense to them? Can they afford that expense? Is it fair? Is there stigma attached to taking part in this research or to the thing that we're wanting to ask questions about? Might it cause distress? What kinds of things can we do to reduce or mitigate those kinds of harms? So again, I'm just going to pause at that point in case anybody wants to jump in before we go on a little bit further and ask anything now that seems urgent, or make any comments.
So Julie, there's a comment in the chat from Joe Knight about research is possible without consent, as possibly to talk about that.
Yeah, we can talk about that. Okay. Shall we come back to that after, because that's potentially quite a big question, isn't it? And we might be able to to look at what's going on there and how that might happen. So, okay. So what I wanted to do next was to think about how we actually apply these principles in practice, because again, it's a bit like having the structures. We've got all of these structures and these bodies and these processes, and then we've got these principles. But in practice, what are we supposed to be doing? So ethical requirements generally, which are common to all research with human participants, is that there should be, or there should be a very good reason why we do not have full, free and prior informed consent. The prior being quite important, because even today, especially perhaps not so much nationally but internationally, it's surprising how often the idea of retrospective consent comes up, and that's obviously quite important, because it's not really consent if you've said yes afterwards, is it? So because you don't have the chance to say no. So it comes out in consent. It comes out in people's right to withdraw without any ill effects on them. So basically, can they stop taking part, and can they do that easily? Are we looking after their data? Are we collecting it carefully? Are we keeping it confidential? Are we compensating for any harm? And obviously, at one end of the range, that may be quite extreme possibilities of harm in, say, some more unusual kinds of clinical research, perhaps. But generally speaking, we would be looking at things like, can we compensate for distress that might be caused, for upset, and for anything else that might happen. But that idea of mitigating any kind of harm needs to be in there, and the idea of it being subject to ethical approval is the other one. So we've got here issues of choice, basically. Can you choose whether to do it or not, and can you stop? Is the data being looked after, and is any harm going to be mitigated? And does it have any kind of approval? Has there been any oversight? Because I think that's something to remember when we feel like we're trying to jump through all of these barriers about how we get ethical approval. What this is about is some kind of oversight of an independent, usually group of broadly peers, having a look at that and thinking, okay, is that okay? Can we all live with that, in a sense? Can we all agree that that is a good thing to do? Are there ways to make it better? For myself, I actually prefer it. I think I feel much more confident in the work that I do, knowing that things have been through that, and that sometimes things are improved by what people want to do. I don't think I've ever experienced anything that wasn't allowed to go ahead because of ethics. And again, some people may perhaps want to talk about that, but as a general feeling, I would say if there is any kind of ethical unease about something, then maybe that's an instinct that we should be taking seriously and thinking about, not necessarily having a knee-jerk reaction to, but we should be thinking, is that really something we should be doing? But that is obviously just my opinion. So those are the sorts of things that we're looking at. And the purpose of the ethics application is just to demonstrate really that that's what you're doing. So what it needs to do is to explain what you're going to do and why you're going to do it, and who the participants are, how you're going to recruit them, and how is the consent going to work. What does taking part in the project mean for them? What's going to happen to them, and over things like what time period and how. What are we going to do with the results? And then again, that takes us back to explaining what we're going to do and why. So that's the purpose of the ethics application. Sometimes they can be quite short. They don't have to be very dense, very long, very complicated documents. They often feel more complicated than they are, I think. But essentially, that's what we're trying to do. And so what I wanted to do was just to go through a few examples really of not of ethics applications, but just some ideas around the kinds of things, sort of do's and don'ts, and things that do actually help, to see if that can prompt some discussion. But I think trying not to think of it as an obstacle really helps, although of course to most of us it does sort of present itself as another task that we have to do before we can get on with our project. But ideally, in a perfect world, it should become a focus for you to think it all through and function as a protocol for your study. So it's not only clinical trials that need things like protocols. It's really, really useful to have something even for a much smaller study, so that when the questions come up, as they so often do, of, oh, I don't know if we can do that, what did we say in the ethics, we can go back and check, and it will actually be there. We will have already thought of it, and that's obviously very helpful. So I wanted to go on and just run quickly through a few things that make the application, I would say, swifter to review from a reviewer's end, but also more useful for ourselves. I think explaining technical terms is really important, perhaps a basic one, but really important. Being consistent about the language that you're using. Are you doing a survey or is it a questionnaire? The number of times that can become confused by people, and it just makes it clearer to read, because if you're reviewing, you're thinking, well, are there two things here, or is there only one thing? And I do actually have a colleague at another university, a different European institution, but actually had a paper kicked back from Nature because they said it wasn't clear between the survey, which was the methodology, and the questionnaire, which was the instrument. So I think it's probably quite important to think about the kind of language that we're using and the impact that they can have. Do include all of the supporting documentation. Don't leave things off or forget them, and label them with the titles and the appendices, numbers, and anything you can do to make it easier for a reviewer to pick up that application and review it will make the review swifter. It might not affect the outcome, but it will make it go more smoothly, and it will give you less to do if there are any questions. So things like cross-referencing the documentation are really important. Using any protocols that you've got, flow charts to illustrate what's happening. I frequently find myself saying to people, maybe just do a flow chart of what the participant's journey is, and then we can see those steps, because it isn't maybe very clear in a written narrative. And finally, I mean, perhaps the biggest one really is to get somebody else to read it through before you submit it, to proofread it, correct it, make sure it all matches up, and ideally don't do that yourself, because after a certain point it's almost impossible to read your own work, I think, and not spot the problems. But those are sort of practical things about the application rather than its actual content. These are things that I have seen people do. I think we've probably all seen people do, which I think is best to be avoided. So don't use technical terms without explaining what they are. Again, don't use different terms for the same thing. Is it a focus group or is it a meeting? It needs to be clear what's going on. I've got a couple of examples of things in the following slides, but try not to answer not applicable to any of the questions that you're asked, because unless the question specifically is about doing something like archaeological remains or human tissue, not applicable is probably unlikely to be a helpful answer. So don't include documentation that you haven't clearly labelled or isn't clear what it's doing there, and don't submit badly presented documentation either. If you take the extra time to do it properly, it will help. In that sense, it's a bit like doing an exam, and any of the simple things that you can do will help. I think engaging with the questions is a really good idea. This brings us back to the harm questions that we were talking about earlier. this is a question from the UCLan ethics application form. So if asked, does it involve any possible distress? It's highly unlikely that it's going to be no for absolutely everything. I think most activities, if we think about them, do have some potential for causing distress, because we never know who it is that we're talking to or what's likely to distress people. Obviously, there are some places where it's going to be obvious that it's a difficult area, but not always. And I think it's important to emphasise that questions like this aren't trying to catch anybody out. What they're looking for is the identification of what a risk is and then how you're going to mitigate it. Often you can mitigate something by saying, yes, there is a possibility that it might distress somebody talking about this, but if the participant sheets say, we advise you not to take part if you think you're going to be upset by this, and then we provide support information for afterwards, that's probably adequate, because it only needs to be proportionate. Doesn't mean that you can't do it. I think what worries ethics reviewers is if you say no and they're sitting there thinking, but there is, and maybe they haven't thought this through. So I'd also recommend not dismissing the questions when you're putting it together. Frequently, I see not applicable as an answer to these kinds of questions about what arrangements have been made for certain groups of participants. And it does specifically ask there about translation, use of interpreters, and frequently that question is just dismissed with no thought at all. Maybe what might they do for BSL interpreters? What about non-English languages? And I think it's becoming increasingly unacceptable just not really to think about that. So again, best to have a strategy or a justification often for why you're doing it the way that you're doing it, even if you would like it to be better, but there isn't enough funding, which is frequently the answer to so many things. A useful tip about using the questions to your advantage is to think about what you want to do with your research, how you want to disseminate it later. And again, this is an example from the UCLan form, which I have best access to, but you know, the other universities and other places have similar questions. So there's a whole list of things that you could say that you are going to do with your output. If you don't tick the right ones, technically speaking, you haven't got ethical approval to write a journal paper and publish it if you didn't tick it here. And I have seen people who were adamant that they were only going to write a dissertation or thesis and they were never going to publish it. But to me, that's just a little bit short-sighted. It's better to tick as much as you can, because it doesn't bind you into definitely doing a conference presentation, but it does mean that you can if you get the opportunity. And increasingly, journals will expect you to provide evidence of your ethical approval before they will publish a paper, if it had human participants, for example, or some kinds of data. So it is important to get this right. And if you can build it in from the beginning, then you're designing out problems for yourself later on. A few, I'm going to call them rookie errors, which isn't meant to be insulting, but generally I think it does come early perhaps in people's careers, is that people have too many points of contact with participants, often in interview studies, for example, at the beginning, just too many in terms of contacting them, briefing them about what's going to happen, having the contact, debriefing them afterwards, things like that. And it's better to keep that to a minimum, because you're not trying to be people's friend. You actually have to be separate from that. Collecting irrelevant data, something important to think about really in terms of your approvals, because the data that you're collecting should be relevant. You should be able to say what you're going to do with it, especially in small scale studies. What are you going to do with information about somebody's marital status, or for example their pet ownership? Do you really need to know that? So that's important to think about. And the issue of wet signatures, by which we mean an actual pen on an actual piece of paper on consent forms to take part, is something that often catches people out as well, because it is something, I think perhaps especially, but not only when people come from a clinical background, they're perhaps more inclined to think that that is the standard, but in fact it isn't necessary to do that. And I have a couple of notes about consent. When we do online surveys with people, it's just a tick box list and people agree to certain things, and then they can carry forward to the survey, and that's fine. You don't need their signature, you don't need to know who they are, they're completely anonymous. And these days as well, we don't need, especially post-COVID, and we've learned so much from doing work in lockdown, all of us I think, is that we can audio record consent. We don't need to expect people to go to a lot of trouble if we're doing stuff at a distance, to post things back and forth, to download things and sign them. We can collect consent online through a Microsoft form, for example, which goes straight into the university systems, or we can do it through an audio recording at the beginning of an interview. So we don't need to make lives difficult for ourselves by doing things in a more complicated way than necessary, which I hope is a bit of a counterpoint to a lot of the other things which can sound a bit overwhelming. I'm very nearly at the end here, so that we can kind of open it up a little bit. But I would say, for people who haven't done it before, try and be confident about it. Make sure you ask for that input and that advice, and take your time over it. And in terms of the kind of the register at which you need to engage with the ethical approval, I would say think of it as though you're applying for a job that you really want, or you're trying to pass an exam, even though you're not. But for me, that idea of, all right, make this like a job application for something that you really want, is the kind of level that you should be pitching that at. And you can push back if people set you conditions when they review your application. You can push back at that and say, no, actually, we really don't want to do that, or no, actually, you haven't understood, we want to do this for this reason. And often, you know, that's fine. There won't be any reason why people won't accept that, because it makes you seem more confident in that sense, and often encourages us to think things through. So I think that's important. And I just wanted to finish off on a slightly lighter note, really, which is really, how bad can it be? And this is just a few examples of things that I've seen. I've seen in applications where people have redacted the information from the setting because they thought that their participants' confidentiality should be respected. Obviously, it was impossible to do anything with that because we didn't know what was going to happen. And people have refused to provide things like their safeguarding training dates because they say it's confidential. We've had some fairly bizarre data management plans where people have specifically said that they were going to store sensitive personal data from their participants in a nice box under their bed. And I think my favourite of all time was somebody who had this great idea, which was probably very effective but not very GDPR compliant, of destroying their confidential data by burning it in a field, in a bonfire. So I think as long as you don't do anything like that, probably you'll be fine. But I think, yeah, that's kind of enough for me, and I've talked for long enough, but it would be nice to have a bit of a chat with people if there's anything specific, particularly the idea of doing research without consent, that we should maybe start with. But I might pass back to Andy for the chat parts.
Thank you, Julie. That was very, very illuminating, and it's always good to end on some funnies as well. I don't know if people have this plenty of time to still have some questions. If people would like to ask Julie anything, given her experience. I don't know whether, as you said, Julie, the question about research without consent might be a place to start.
Yeah. Might be interesting to know why. Yeah, what that was that you were thinking. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the person that raised that. What that was that had brought that to mind. And
So basically, if you're using, for example, I do lots of research with routinely collected data, NHS data. It's often completely, it's often anonymized, and individuals are not consented. When you go into a healthcare situation, they are not given a consent form for their routinely collected data to be recorded, and so consent isn't there. So there's two approaches, which is one, anonymization, and then that tends to deal with the issue, and the other is to go through the confidential advisory group with HRA. So I was just thinking it's worth putting it out there that yes, consent is considered really, really important, but there are circumstances where it's reasonable to go forward without consent.
Yeah, yes, obviously you're right about the things that you're talking about, but I think for me what I would be saying is that isn't, in a sense, in the meaningful sense using that without consent, because people have provided that. Either they will have already provided it and actually been told in some way that it will be used, and that's a kind of a normal expectation, as you say, with regard to routine care or whatever, where everybody knows what the parameters of that are in terms of sort of confidentiality and things, and therefore it will fit, or else you will have got approval from somewhere else to use it. So I appreciate your point about that data itself, if it's secondary data or whatever, not having been used with direct consent, but it's not, that doesn't make it a kind of free-for-all situation.
No, absolutely not a free-for-all. It's just important because it's always, I find that consent is often talked about as the only way, and it's actually not. And I think it's important to raise that, because otherwise we won't use any secondary data. And
well, that's right, and that would be absurd,
unethical. And it would be quite unethical not to find out what we can with some of those sources.
And I think a lot of it as well, I mean, it often is worth saying is that it often depends on the how the original data was collected. So we often get a lot of questions from people about secondary data, using secondary data, and often what they want to do, so there may be some very rich and very useful data which has been collected by say a small NGO that works in a particular area, and they've done some evaluations about their services and how people find them useful, maybe something like that, and then a researcher would like to use that data to do something with, but if the people that contributed that data in the first place were not specifically asked if that could be shared, and it doesn't form any kind of that basis of providing that information in the first place, then you've got two options. You either don't do it because it wouldn't be GDPR compliant or fair or reasonable because the people wouldn't have expected it, or you can go back and ask them, which is often impossible. So yeah, just to make a point that yes, certainly you can do what Joe's been talking about, but you also have to be very careful how you apply that kind of principle, if you like, and that you can't just expect it will be okay in every setting. But yeah, okay.
There's another question from Linda, which is about getting ethical approval. Do you need ethical approval if you're going to do work with PPI in terms of group discussions, etc.?
Oh, it's always a really tricky one. That generally speaking, no, you wouldn't, because some of the ways that reasons you would need to have ethical approval. So say within my university, for example, if you're not intending to directly publish the work, so if you collect it in a group for PPI, you're not keeping records of who those people are necessarily, other than for organising the event. You're not going to attribute anything to them, and you're not directly going to publish the kinds of things that they've said, then generally it isn't felt to be necessary. But it's a good question, because it is one of those kind of slightly borderline areas. But you know, we can kind of trap ourselves into a corner, if you like, by saying that we can't do anything at all until we've got ethical approval. And then obviously, how are we going to co-design things if we can't talk to people about what their priorities are and things? So generally no, but if you're not sure, the best thing to do would be to approach whoever the ethical approval body would be if you're within an institution, and often they'll just send you an email back and say no, that's fine, and then you're covered.
Has anyone got any other questions they'd like to ask? I'd like to ask about the audit. I guess audit has always been seen as an option for avoiding ethical approval, but I assume that's quite a dangerous thing to do, and the dividing line between audit and research, and then what you can do with the work that you do afterwards, it is determined by whether you get ethical approval associated with it. So it isn't really an easy option out, because it limits what you can do in the future. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it is really. I mean, I guess it comes up, doesn't it, often around the Health Research Authority, say, as an example, so for NHS, or I assume social care data, although I know less about that side of it. But certainly with the NHS, the Health Research Authority often consider, so audit data, so literally where somebody has audited services, or evaluations are the same. So often staff members will do some kind of evaluation of the service they work in. They'll do some questionnaires and surveys with service users, things like that. And as far as the NHS is concerned, that's not research, because it's not generating new knowledge. It's kind of evaluating what already exists. And that's the reason that it will come out of those tools as not research. But then, as you say, Andy, you might have a problem with what you do with your results afterwards, so you might think it's easy. So for those of us who are in universities, we will need to have ethical approval or clearance for that work, whatever the HRA has said. So I guess we have an extra whatever the word would be, comfort there, protection, because we will have already passed that through, and our own ethics approvals will say, yes, you can do that because it's come out as evaluation, but you still need to be careful about the data and this and this. But the publication is a big issue, because obviously increasingly journals want to see, quite rightly want to see, proof that you've had approval. But my understanding is that if you have something from the HRA, and correct me if I'm wrong, but from the HRA, for example, saying that no, this is evaluation and it's fine, and you've got agreement from, say, the R&D department, that would function anyway, I think, as ethical approval. But it can be a bit, yeah, it's a bit of a knotty issue, isn't it? And something to be thought about in advance rather than afterwards.
Probably better to be safe and
yes,
at least contact the ethics body to establish where you sit.
Yeah. I mean, we have actually done that. There was a study I worked on a few years ago where we were evaluating a palliative care service, and it actually went, and we wanted to talk to the patients who were in end stage of life, and it went through the HRA, and they were like, no, this is evaluation, it's fine, you don't need ethics approval. And we were, as researchers, we were actually quite uncomfortable with that, just because of the nature of what we were doing and the people we were talking to, and the risks, if you like, and their vulnerabilities. So we did actually end up in a bizarre situation where we requested that it went through an NHS Research Ethics Committee, just to make sure that and that did happen. But that's quite an unusual situation, I think. But we felt much more comfortable doing it that way, because it was a slightly unusual situation in terms of the position of the hospice within the health service and things like that. So yeah, I mean, it's worth thinking about and trying to work out what's going to serve you best, I think, for those kinds of things. Yeah.
I'm just reading. Joe's put something in the chat about service evaluations. They're very tricky because they generate new knowledge. Or they can generate new knowledge.
Yeah. I mean, often they certainly can. Yeah, and I mean that's definitely my position. And I think that I mean, it's just a question of having sort of different parameters, really. I think what comes out of the HRA often to say something from the evaluation and it's fine, and it doesn't need full NHS ethics committee approval, that's fine, but it's still going to need other governance. It's still going to need information governance and things like that to make sure what you're doing with the data. And it also is about where you want to disseminate it as well, isn't it? Whether you want to be able to publish it, or whether it's just, say, for example, going back to the trust as an internal report. Or but I think, I mean, yeah, it's a good comment, because often it does generate new knowledge and people think it won't, and then it does. So it's, again, sort of getting a bit ahead of the game, really, I think. So in a sense, you can't go wrong by getting ethical approval, but often people might think that they don't have the time or the capacity or the energy, and they'd rather not do it unless they have to. But it's more difficult to get it retrospectively. So yeah.
I don't know if anyone else has any other questions they'd like to ask Julie.
I mean, I'm interested in what people think about this idea of not having, if you like, the wet signature on the consent form, because it's something that's, in terms of general practice, I think it's really changed a lot over the last 2 or 3 years. The recording it on, you know, either by interviewing people over Teams, for example, or Zoom, and recording their consent live as an audio recording rather than having a piece of paper. And I'm just wondering how people feel about that, or if people have got any concerns or opinions about that or anything, or if we're all just happy with it being a brave new world.
Doesn't seem like there.
No, that's great then. Yeah, because you don't always know, yeah, if other people are as comfortable with things as you are, and I think it's really important, isn't it, to just have that sense of, you know, well, have people got a sense that participants are worried about this, or would prefer to do it in different ways, or if there are any issues. I mean, are there issues that come up a lot for people with participants in terms of how they think things should be governed? And, you know, there's a lot of debate about, are we giving participants too much detailed, dense information to the point where it puts them off because we have to use certain forms of words? And by the time somebody's read the privacy notice, you know, they really aren't interested anymore. And not because of the content, but just because they can't be bothered. And I'm just wondering if other people are encountering things like that, and if that's something that is a concern. Or
I always worry about when doing trials and getting data collection, which is obviously a different matter. The fact that we deluge people with so much information just to collect a degree of information from that. So I assume that, you know, there's quite a process to go through, which must be slightly off-putting.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's worth having a go, if you like, at being a participant occasionally. I mean, sometimes I'd make an effort to take part in somebody's survey or something, just simply to sort of think, all right, well, how does this feel? How do I feel about the information that we're giving me? And, you know, you're thinking, actually, could you not make that shorter? Could you not make it easier? It's almost longer than the survey. So I think it's interesting, isn't it?
I think we've got a question from Jackie.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I'm just doing a patient information sheet at the moment that, you know, you want to make yourself sound somebody approachable, you know, that the people that you're trying to recruit can ask you questions and feel like you're an approachable, friendly person. But then the small print, or whatever you want to call it, it's like those financial adverts where, you know, buy a VW Polo, and then there's like this massive information at the end about how your data might be used and how your financial details will be stored and what database, blah, 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 blah. And I feel like that's what my patient information sheet has become, something like some sort of monstrous automaton that isn't anything to do with me, and that actually, to those people that I'm approaching, really want to read all that about that their data might be stored in China or somewhere, you know, by the Microsoft software that we're using. And I understand the importance of it, but I do worry that it's alienating.
Yeah, and I think I agree, Jackie. I think it's, and it's difficult to know how to navigate that, really, isn't it? I don't know, because we don't have a lot of, you know, if there are things that we have to put in, then we have to put them in. And I do agree with you, really. And I think especially, I mean, it depends on who it is that you're working with. I mean, if often we're working with maybe perhaps more vulnerable communities, or people who don't necessarily have the literacy capacity to read all of that information in English, you know, how is that really working, and is it actually really benefiting anybody? So I think it's a difficult one, but obviously we have to do what we're asked to do. Something that we did recently, and this was on these people were in neurorehabilitation, so obviously there were kind of brain injuries and things like that, and we actually did like a supplementary backup form with all of that kind of information in it, and we were taking quite a lot of time and making sure that obviously they could ask other people and get support from families if they wanted, with the consent. But so we sort of had a short version, and then we had a backup version which had all of the detail in. And I think that worked quite well, because we had given it to them and they were able to acknowledge that they'd had access to it, but we weren't actually expecting them to go through the whole thing, because it just didn't seem proportionate, really. And that went through full NHS ethics as well, and they were okay with that. So I think there are ways around it, but I think it's a really good point.
And Robin's got a question as well. Robin? Robin's got a hand up.
Hi.
Hi.
I think you might be on mute, Robin. I'm not sure if you're talking already.
Right. maybe Robin doesn't know. Okay, is anyone else?
Hi, really sorry, I couldn't unmute it. It wouldn't let me unmute. I was just going to say something very similar, that we have been putting together 2 information sheets. One that is user-friendly and based on the evidence in terms of what people actually use. And if you look at you know, the literature, there is quite a lot of evidence about what people want. So for clinical trials and things, actually what they're looking for is a instruction: turn up on this day and we're going to do X, turn up on that day and we're going to do Y. So sort of flow charts of what involvement mean. And for other studies, we did a quite an interesting one with sort of Dopplers and things on babies' heads as they came out of theatre. And we did a mock-up and put together a whole series of photographs. And the ethics committee really liked that, in terms of it showed parents what the baby would look like when they came out of theatre, so that they weren't concerned. And actually that was all they wanted to know. What you know, what does this feel like? What does it look like? Because as much as you try to describe something, it doesn't necessarily look like. But anyway, yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Sorry, I really apologise. The university doesn't support Zoom anymore, so I'm trying to use it on my phone and I'm struggling.
Okay, yeah, no, that's great. I'm just thinking, it's just made me think actually that I saw some of the best participant documentation I've seen recently actually came from a study where people were doing focus groups with adults with learning disabilities, and they'd taken a lot of care about the way that they presented that information. And there were a lot of photographs in it, a lot of diagrams. It was really clear, it was very nicely written, and it wasn't written in a dumbed down way, if you'll excuse me. It was really, really clear. And I was looking at that thinking we should just use that format more generally, because it was very clear, it was short, it was concise, that it would have been quite difficult to misunderstand what was being said. And yeah, I do worry. So I think, yeah, Jackie and Robin have said that, yeah, it may be that the way that we express these things is not actually communicating as effectively as we would like it to. So it's definitely a message for, yeah, well, for me to take away as well, really, but something to think about. Yeah.
I don't know if anyone has any other further points they'd like to raise with Julie. I realise we're getting towards 3 o'clock. If not, I'd just like to thank you, Julie, for the presentation. It's really good and very helpful in putting together points. Oh, Robin's hand's gone up again.
Robin's back. Might be a legacy hand.
Oh, well, I'll thank you again. Thanks, Julie, for taking the time to put together the presentation and presenting it to us. It's very, very interesting, and as I say, it's helpful to me because I certainly don't do many ethics applications. So thank you very much, and also thanks to everyone else for attending as well today.